So we're going to talk now about the two phases of life, and this is a really key concept in biology that we'll sort of touch on over and over the course of the semester. And that is that life is both unified in the sense that all forms of life that we see today have a very specific common set of characteristics. And we've already talked about those properties of life earlier, and then we'll also talk about the cell and the key features that all cells have, and over the course of the semester, some key chemical reactions that all cells have, and all of these things that derive from coming from a common ancestor. So the unity of life is because of biological evolution, and that's what we're going to be talking a lot more about. And connected to that is also diversity. So we all come from the same origins, but organisms have diversified over time, and you've probably heard of this concept before. In many cases, that's driven by adaptation to different environments. And so if you look at Earth today, even though we all came from the same cells, we have organisms that are adapted to live in every kind of environment, from the bottom of the ocean all the way into the atmosphere. So again, evolution explains unity and diversity of life. And as I alluded to before, life started on Earth in very primitive cells that were a lot more like bacteria a very, very, very long time ago, 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. And I think this idea of time is really important to evolution. And we won't touch on it a lot in this class, but we have a very hard time conceptualizing 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. I mean, if you think about it, maybe you know who your great-grandparents are or were. Maybe you know who your great-great-grandparents were. That's about as far back as most people know about their own family, and that's 100 years of time. So we have a very hard time imagining several hundred years, and certainly several thousand years, and really we have a very hard time wrapping our minds around millions of years or billions of years. And that's really the time frame for evolution, and that can be one of the reasons why it can be so hard for us to understand it. So just keep in mind in these next slides that we're going to be talking about that when we see these changes, they don't happen one day. Like tomorrow I have a flipper, today I have an arm. It's like millions of years ago there was an arm and now there's a flipper. So just try and hold that in your mind, because these primitive cells 3.5 to 4 billion years ago over very vast periods of time are going to undergo changes that give rise to the species we see today, and that's going to take billions of years. You know, the species that we're familiar with, like animals, didn't arise until 100 or a couple hundred million years ago, and so that's just a blink of an eye in the story of life on Earth. So one of the sort of key examples of evolutionary change, and one that you've probably heard about, and certainly there's many, many other examples, but because this is so visual, we can wrap our mind around it a little better, is this idea of modification of existing structures. So evolution doesn't create something new. It changes something that's old into something that's a little different. And the classic example here that's presented in your textbook is mammalian limbs. So we have a little rat here, a little bat, and a dolphin. And you probably know that all three of these are mammals. They have live birth and other key features of mammals, including production of milk. And that's really the defining feature of mammals, actually. So that's what makes them all mammals. Now, the very first mammals appeared on land. And so what happened is that the earliest mammals had these limbs that are good for walking on land. And mammals did really well on land for a long period of time, and after the dinosaurs especially, they started to do really well. And so what that creates is competition for resources. And so that's going to be a driving force, this competition for resources, which food, right, so that they can reproduce. Is going to be a driving force for why some organisms might start to live on the margins, maybe hanging out next to the river or hanging out next to the ocean, or maybe hanging out in trees and trying to eat bugs. And again, you know, imagine this not as something that happens overnight, but something that takes millions of years. This limb becomes modified to serve a new purpose. So in the case of the dolphin, the flipper now is modified for swimming. And the sort of evidence for this is if you look at the bone structure. There's no reason for a flipper to have bone structure like an arm. It doesn't help the flipper function. But if you look at the bone structure of the flipper, you can see very much the same structure that you're probably familiar with. The upper arm bone, the 2 lower arm bones, and then here's the 5 finger-like bones. And again, this really is not serving a purpose in the flipper anymore, but that bone structure is telling us about the history of this structure. And now this is all filled in with tissue. And again, trying to imagine how this could be a change that happened, you've probably heard of people being born with webbing between their fingers, right? So that's when you would have tissue still in between these fingers, because we all have tissue when we're in the womb between these fingers, and what happens is the tissue gets chewed out. And some people are born without that tissue chewed out. And that's just a random single change that can happen in people. And for us, it's not a benefit, and so, it doesn't become common. And in fact, today it's surgically removed so that they don't get made fun of in school. But if you can imagine that early mammal hanging out next to the water, all of a sudden they could swim better, and they could get food better. And because they could get food better, they could have more babies. And because they had more babies, they tended to give their babies those same little webbing between their finger structures. And again, thinking about it over millions and millions of years, that could give rise to a flipper. And same idea with the bat. Again, like, you can still see this bone structure in there. That's a history that tells us that this came from this. So how does this process occur? Well, you've probably heard of natural selection as well. And this is this idea that organisms descend from ancestors, and they will change based on a mutation. So a mutation is a change in the genetic material, and that sometimes causes a change in traits. And these mutations lead to random variation. And you know what random variation is because you know that people all look different. That's random variation. Some of us have brown hair, some of us have blonde hair, some of us have dark skin, some of us have light skin. Some of us are tall, some of us are short. So any population, and even wild animals, and I know sometimes this is hard because when we see wild animals, they all look alike to us. Like a zebra looks like a zebra, looks like a zebra, looks like a zebra. But believe it or not, there's variation even within zebras. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, some of them are more muscular, some of them are less muscular. This is variation that we don't necessarily see, but it's always there just due to random mutations. In many situations, that random variation exists with no consequences. So many mutations are just neutral. And certainly most human mutations are neutral, like the color of my eyelashes or the color of my eyebrows or how big my nose is. These are things that are just, they're never going to be selected on. They're just going to randomly vary in the population. And some people have big and small and light and dark, and it doesn't really matter. But if the environment, if certain environmental conditions occur, then one variation might give that organism a better chance of surviving. And if that helps that organism survive better, it also helps them reproduce more. So basically, the longer you live, the more babies you have. And if I reproduce more, I pass on my traits to more of the future generations. And so more of the future generations will have my particular trait. And again, imagining this over long, long periods of time, that can become the trait that becomes the trait that defines the population, and that can lead to a new species. So the really common example is depicted over here. And again, many of you may have heard about the birds before that were studied by Charles Darwin, who's of course this amazing biologist, innovative thinker who developed the idea of natural selection in the 1800s. And so the basic idea is that there's a population of birds, and this may be hard for you to see in the picture, but if you look closely, you can see that some of the birds, this one here, for example, has a large beak, and this one here has a really small beak. So they have random variation in beak size. And as long as food is plentiful, this doesn't really matter. You're just going to have birds with different beak sizes. But if something happens in the environment, then you're going to have a shift based on those environmental conditions. And so in this case, there's a change in the environment to where the seeds that are available for these birds to eat are big seeds. So if you think about it, big seeds are going to be able to be eaten better by the bird with the big beak. This guy's going to struggle because of a small beak to eat those big seeds. And so because this guy can't access food as well when there's only big seeds, it's not going to survive as long. If it doesn't survive as long, it's not going to reproduce as much. And so over time, you see that the bird that reproduces more is the bird with the big beak. And again, over vast periods of time, this can lead to a population that all has big beaks. And then, why this leads to a new species is that at the same time that they all have big beaks, you can accumulate other random changes as well. And so in this case, you can see that there was also a color change. Now, this color change maybe doesn't actually matter for survival, but it just so happened that the birds that had big beaks also ended up with this color change. So this is also this idea that survival of the fittest leads to changes in the whole population. So the fittest in this environment was the big beaks. In a different environment, it wouldn't be big beaks, but in this particular environment, it was big beaks. And so you get a new population with big beaks. So my question here is, does an organism evolve? So an organism is an individual. And remembering our hierarchy of life, at the next level, I have my populations. Organisms as individuals do not evolve. They can't. There's not the periods of time. Remember, because evolution is change over vast periods of time. An organism doesn't live those vast periods of time. Populations evolve, not organisms. So another classic example of evolution is the modern horse. So natural selection can lead to new species, and they come from ancestors of pre-existing species. So changes will happen that lead to modern species. This is, in the case of the horse, this is an example of vertical evolution, and you can see there's an ancestor here, and then there's a vertical tree that gives rise to the modern horse. If you look at the most ancient horse, and one of the reasons why the horse is such a classic example is because we have fossil records that are really good for the horse. So we have, for these guys that are depicted here, we have fossils that show this change happening over time. So the original horse ancestor was pretty small, their legs were shaped differently, their feet were shaped differently, and they lived in shrubby, foresty areas, and this body shape worked well for them. What happened over these periods of time, what happened over these vast periods of time is that the environment began to change. And so the environment that they were living in dried up, became more dry, the trees didn't live anymore, and it became grasslands. And grass is a good source of food, but you have to eat a lot more of it than you have to eat trees. And so the animals had to travel a lot further in order to get the same amount of food. And so the adaptations that we see appear in the fossil record are longer legs that can travel longer distances, changes in the foot structure for walking these longer distances, a broader frame. And again, all of these arise from mutations in the genetic material that, because of the environment, become more common. So again, this idea of natural selection. Like I said earlier, not all mutations are beneficial. Some mutations are neutral, and if they're neutral, you're just going to get random variation. So of course today, if you look at horses, there's lots of variation in colors, and that's just neutral variation. It doesn't matter for their survival. You can also get negative mutations, and negative mutations will be negatively acted on by natural selection. So if it's a mutation that leads to a trait that's bad, like being a color that makes them really easily eaten, for example, then that will tend to be selected against. So it will become less common in the population. So if it's a beneficial trait, it will become more common, or will tend to become more common in that environment. If it's negative, it will tend to become less common in that environment. And neutral will just be randomly present in the population. As sort of a last note here, there is something called horizontal evolution. So notice with the horse, we're talking about vertical evolution. Horizontal evolution is something very specific in prokaryotic cells like bacteria today, where they're able to exchange genetic material with non-related organisms. So where one bacteria that's unrelated can give a trait to a different bacteria or give a mutation to a different bacteria. And we'll talk about this at the end of the semester.